The struct is another object that you'll see out there in C++, and I wanted to point it out to you here in a video so you'll understand what it is, and I also wanted to give a little warning. But first of all, let's talk about what a struct is. A struct is actually a variation on the idea of a class. Now, in C++, understand that when we're talking about a struct, we're talking about really the same identical thing as a class, except that all the members are public by default. Now, you've noticed in other videos in this course, when we're working with classes, that cat class that I've used as in a lot of examples, that we have to mark our variables and our functions as public because they're private by default. In a struct, everything's public by default. You'll have to mark it private. Okay? Now, is that any big reason to use a struct? Maybe not. Okay? But these things are created and used just like classes. And so the question becomes, well, then why don't you use a class? Well, whenever I teach about C++, if it's a live situation, and I ask what's the difference between a struct and a class, the .NET programmers, and I am one, okay, I'm twice the center that they are, okay, so the C++ and the VB programmers will inevitably throw their hands up and say, well, a struct is allocated on the stack and a class is allocated on the heap. A class is a reference object, a reference type, and a struct is a value type in .NET parlance. And that is true in .NET. It's not true in C++, okay? So understand that in C++ you don't get the same efficiency of using a struct as opposed to a class like you do in the .NET world, okay? Now, let me give you a little history. So if that's the case, if a struct's the same thing as a class except for this public and private situation with the members in the class, the variables and the functions, then what's the big deal? How did we get here? Well, the struct originated in the C language, and then Windows was written in C, and the struct was used quite a bit in that programming. Now, as a result, the idea of the struct kind of got burned into the programmer world, if you will, and so you hear a lot of old timers that they're talking about. So the struct was out there, Windows kind of established it. They get handled different than the .NET programming languages. They got thrown into C++ because more or less as a backward compatibility thing to C. All right, so there's no real magic here, but these things are used and you will see them out there, and some people will just use a struct as opposed to using a class because everything that's going to be in there is going to be public, and they just use a struct. It makes it easier, and everybody's okay. All right, but you're going to see these things. You can use them. I just wanted you to be aware of them, and we'll do a little example in a separate movie and let you see what one looks like in code.